Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the main lines of criticism of the Epicurean position that we see getting made by the Skeptic in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Book 1, has to do with, well, what is it that God actually does? And we could class this under the rubric of inactivity. Now, interestingly, in this part of the work, we're going to see Cotta bringing up 5 different questions, which all get kind of rolled into this. He begins by saying, granting your view that God is the image and likeness of man, which is another thing he's contested, what is his dwelling place and local habitation? And what activities does he spend his life? What constitutes the happiness which you attribute to him? And then he's going to go on a little bit further and say, okay, about your deity, about your God, I want to know, and he goes through 5 different things. So first, where he dwells. Where do we actually find God? Where in the universe do the gods exist? This is one significant issue. Second, if he does move in space, what is his motive, his reason for moving in space? Maybe the gods actually don't move at all, but if he does, well, we want to know why. Third, he says, it being a special characteristic of animate beings to desire some end, some goal that's appropriate to their nature, what is it that God actually wants? What does God desire? What could move God to do things? Fourth, upon what subject does he employ his mental activity, his motu mentis, and reason? What does God think about, you could say? And then finally, how is God actually happy and eternal? All of these things are matters that Epicureans claim to have some beliefs, some answers about. All of these end up being either unanswerable or incoherent. What the Epicureans say doesn't really make sense when we look through it. So if we start with the first discussion, there's this very interesting theory of images, right? So the gods can't be actual bodily things like you or me, even though they do have, the shape of human beings. So the Epicurean position is that there's a form or shape of God, whatever it is that this is, and it's a kind of image, an imago, and it's perceived by thought, not by the senses. So cogitatione. These are things that we can think, even though we can never actually see the gods themselves, right? He says that there's images constantly impinging on our minds, but these are only the presentation of a certain form, a species, right? And so Cotta is going to say, well, what does this possibly mean? What are you talking about? What is the nature of these images? Where do they come from? And he says, you got this from Democritus, but this has been widely criticized. And he says, what can be more improbable than that images of Homer, Archilochus, Romulus, Numa, Pythagoras, and Plato should impinge on me at all, much less that they should do so in the actual shape that these men actually bore. So this leads us to a real question. So, how do these images actually arise? How do they come into being? What is the cause of them? And, where are they coming from? Who are they images of? If I want to say I have images of Zeus in my mind, is there really a being out there somewhere that is Zeus, that these images are of? And then how do they actually get to my mind? And he says, philosophers have called these things empty imaginations, motum in anum, right? So maybe there's really nothing here to these images. And he goes on and he raises a number of other problems that have to do with the atoms and where these are coming from. But that's probably sufficient to set that aside. Now, does that have to do with the real heart of the matter? No, but it does kind of address the question, well, where does God dwell? And what is the motive for moving? And the answer is, well, it just happens that way. And God dwells nowhere in some respect. God isn't something that exists like corporeal matters, but does generate images. Then we get to, other more important questions. So he says, let's consider divine happiness. Now, this is where we really get to the crux of it. So he says, happiness is admittedly impossible without virtue. Okay, so far so good. There was actually an argument that was made before that this is why you have to have, a human shape and all that. So if happiness requires virtue, and virtue is active, actuosa, virtue does things, then we got a problem, don't we? What is the problem here? Virtue is in its nature active, but your God is entirely inactive. He doesn't do anything. That's why he's so happy and blessed and eternal. He's just, out there by himself, godding away, disconnected from the rest of the universe. So that means that whatever you're going to say, God can't actually have virtue. And if that's the case, then God can't really be happy or blessed. So this is going to be a significant problem for the Epicureans. And, they could respond. So this is what Cotta is doing. He's saying, well, what does God's life consist in? And the Epicureans would say a constant succession of things good without any evils. Okay, so, that sounds like a happy life, doesn't it? All good things coming through over and over again all the time. No bad things. And then Cotta says, well, how does that actually work? How are you going to have this? And he says, what are the good things? So from the Epicurean perspective, pleasure is the good, pain is the evil. So this raises some real problems. How can a God who is not corporeal, who is not a body, experience pleasure? He says, pleasures of the body, your school recognizes no pleasures of the mind that don't arise from and come back to the body. The Epicureans did say, well, there's a distinction between mental and physical pleasures, but ultimately, mental pleasures are part of the realm of physical pleasures. They're just transformed in certain ways. And so he goes on and he says, listen, is God going to be able to eat meat and beverages or harmonies, enjoy harmonies of music and flowers or delights of touch and smell? They can't have any of that. I mean, the poets at least say that the gods do that sort of thing, but your God can't procure these delights or enjoy them. So mankind is actually better equipped for enjoying pleasures than God is. Isn't that a weird idea that you have? And he says, well, you'll tell me you consider these pleasures inferior, which merely tickle the senses. And he says, well, you Epicureans, you actually like that. But he does go on and treat another issue. So the Epicureans thought that the best pleasures actually come from freedom from pain and trouble. They made this distinction between what they called static versus dynamic pleasures or moving pleasures. So, think about when you come home from a long day at work and you just relax. You're not actually doing anything, but it feels so good, right? So maybe the gods enjoy this wonderful, being free of any sort of worries or pains or fears or any of that sort of stuff. So he asks, well, does that satisfy the ideal of perfect bliss overflowing with good things? It sounds kind of weak, doesn't it? But it doesn't really hold, because your gods, because they are not actually eternal, they are built up out of atoms in some weird way that we can't really account for. Everything that's made out of atoms is going to break down sometime. So your gods actually have to fear destruction. So they don't actually have a life without pain. Their life is not really all that pleasurable. And he goes on, and there's one other thing that the Epicurean could say. Well, God is engaged in ceaseless contemplation of his own happiness. He has no other object for his thoughts. And Cotta says, well, what is that like? How the hell does that happen? Can we imagine? Can we picture this? It's one thing to say, well, God just thinks about himself and how happy he is. But how did he get happy in the first place? If he's going to contemplate happiness, there's got to be that happiness there. You can't just say, well, the contemplation of the happiness, that's what the happiness is. Because where did you get the happiness from in order to contemplate? So this doesn't seem to make any sense either. And this is because God is inactive. If we had Epicurean gods who were actually engaged in the universe, it would be possible for them to, have pleasures of some sort, but it doesn't seem like they actually do. He's going to wrap up this section by bringing up another very interesting implication of God's inactivity. And he says that what reason do you have for maintaining that human beings owe worship to the gods if the gods don't do anything? He says, if the gods pay no respect to human beings, care for nothing, do nothing at all, why should we actually worship them? Why should we be pious towards them? We don't owe anything to them because they don't do anything for us. They are, presumably blessed because they stay out of the affairs of human beings. And so, the Epicureans would say, well, the wise at least can recognize the wonderfulness, the preeminence and excellence of the gods by nature. And so he says, well, that's fine, but how can there be any excellence in a thing so engrossed in the delights of his own pleasure that he is entirely idle and inactive? And it's actually expressed here, he doesn't do anything. Agat neque egerit. He doesn't do anything at any given time. So where is this excellence of nature shown to us? And the answer is the Epicureans don't have a response. They're gods. They're kind of irrelevant, right? So why would you, in fact, care about this? And really, when you get down to it, it's kind of saying, listen, you Epicureans want to have things both ways, and it's just not going to work. So these are some really interesting skeptical attacks on the Epicurean notion of gods who are, on the one hand, totally inactive, on the other hand, blissfully happy throughout all eternity. These turn out to be, at least from the skeptical position, incompatible with each other.